Recently, the Times newspaper has had a number of reports about, put it one way, Chinese infiltration in British universities. That's how I would describe it. I mean, that's really what it is. It's Chinese state infiltration in our universities, and it's very concerning. And I think the government needs to take it very seriously. So, this is a report I've just been reading. It's from Saturday's Times. The report is by Charlie Parker, Sam Dunning, and Paul Morgan Bentley, head of investigations. It's actually a Times investigation. Cambridge Fellows tutor Beijing elite in art of leadership. So this follows on from a report from a few days before that, in which they spoke about, in which the Times mentioned Professor Peter Nolan, CBE, of Jesus College, Cambridge, who argued that debating the persecution of the Uyghurs would not be conducive to mutual understanding. Um, I'll be honest, I've just emailed the guy and expressed my views on his position. I didn't threaten him. I don't do that. I don't engage in, online threats. It's legal and I wouldn't do that. But I do believe that I have a right as a citizen to express my point of view, and that includes criticism of those in a position of power. And he is in a position of power. He's a senior academic at one of the world's leading universities. So, and I'm not the only one. Ian Duncan Smith, who I certainly have had my differences with or tensions with, the former Tory leader, has rightly said that the programme was evidence of university bosses and British officials ignoring China's human rights abuses. Astonishes me that British civil servants and university officials are able to turn a blind eye to a country that is becoming the single greatest threat to the UK, cozying up to Chinese Communist Party officials. It seems like universities and colleges and the government will do anything for money. There's no such thing as a private company in China. That's absolutely right, there isn't. Every company in China has to have party ties. It's the only way they can get funding. That's why when the phone network Huawei wanted to operate here, and they kept making assurances that they wouldn't have any government ties. It's simply not true because they're duty bound, actually, by the Chinese constitution to report to the CCP if told to. So any Chinese company, it doesn't matter how apolitical they seem, will at somewhere along the level have close CCP ties. Um, so the program that was being referenced there, I understand it is the Cambridge China Development Trust, which rents offices at Jesus College, Cambridge, taught hundreds of the authoritarian regime's most powerful corporate bosses, as well as party officials between 2005 and 2019. Professor Nolan himself was funded by a company belonging to the daughter of Wen Jiabao, China's former premier. Um, so the connections run deep. We're not talking loosely here about sort of cultural links, which would be on the surface harmless. We're talking about political links. And last year, I believe it was the Times report that British academics were selling, or rather sharing information to Chinese officials with military links, ostensibly for science, for mutual understanding of science. But if they were knowingly giving information to people with military ties, that really could count as treason. Um, I think there's a few things the government needs to do. They need to take the problem seriously. They need to cut funding for any department, any university, from Cambridge down to former polytechnics, that have any sort of close relations with the Chinese regime. We need to take it seriously because what the CCP is going to do is see this as kind of a soft spot for entry to undermine its democracy. And what will they do with that? They will use it to intimidate dissidents, uh, not to mention the espionage aspect. Um, Britain is not China. The government doesn't have an iron grip of control over every walk of life. Therefore, it wouldn't be that difficult for the Chinese regime to infiltrate into secure areas. So the government really needs to take this seriously. I think they need to cut funding to send out a message that the likes of Professor Nolan, will feel the heat. I'm not calling for him to be cancelled or threatened or anything like that, but he needs to understand that his position is repugnant. Um, because it's an insult to people who have suffered from this regime. Say that you had a Uyghur student, for example. I know there's probably not many in the UK. Okay, let's say a more plausible example. Let's say you had a Hong Kong student who wanted to voice criticism of the CCP or engage in a debate about the CCP. What Nolan is essentially arguing is they should be silenced because it might offend the Chinese. Well, this is a hypersensitive regime anyway. They'll look for any reason to be offended. Criticize the CCP and you're hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. That's how they frame it. There's a little sidebar piece of information here behind the story. The success of British universities attracts thousands of the world's brightest and best international students every year, but also interest from repressive regimes. One of the sector's biggest partners is China, which sends about 120,000 students, paying up to three times local fees to British campuses each year. With the fastest growing economy in the world and a government keen to invest, universities queue up to promote themselves. Such collaboration was encouraged until recently, as David Cameron's government spent years courting Chinese Communist Party officials to promote the golden era of British-Sino relations. And I think that would be a big cloud on Cameron's legacy. However, rows over Chinese human rights abuses and its aggressive diplomacy have prompted politicians to question Beijing's reach. There are growing fears that the financial dependency of universities in China mean leaders are willfully ignorant to the regime's activities. Cambridge and Oxford each insist they robustly ensure that academic freedom is upheld in relation to donations and sponsorship. I doubt it. I mean, why would this professor, Nolan, be calling for censorship of debate? One can only draw the following conclusions. Either he really is ideological pro CCP, he's trying to make things more comfortable for himself because he's funded by Chinese sources personally, his own professorship is. He's a moral card, which kind of goes into the first two categories, or he's just extremely naive. And I don't think that's viable. He's obviously an intelligent man. So, I, yeah, I'm disgusted by what these academics are doing, and I think they need to feel the heat peacefully. They can lose funding, they can be fiercely criticized, but they need to feel some sort of backlash for what they're doing, pandering to this regime, which right now is incarcerating millions of Uyghur people. It's arguably the largest such persecution since World War II. I mean, the images are harrowing, and seeing Uyghur families split up, women who don't know where their husbands are, children who don't know where their fathers are. It's mostly men, but women are also affected. Forced sterilization, rape in some camps. Um, it really is horrendous. Um, and I believe a day will come when the Chinese people will have to confront the crimes of the CCP in the way the German people had to confront the crimes of the Third Reich. And I don't think it's hyperbole to make a comparison. The only thing that China hasn't done comparable to the Third Reich is started a world war. That is it. I mean, really, we don't even know if there's executions going on. We don't know if there's murders going on. We do know that there's mass incarceration. We do know that families have been separated. And, ostensibly to counter terrorism. This is collective punishment of an entire people. I mean, this would be the equivalent if we had an Islamist attack in the UK and every single British Muslim, estimated about 2 million people, was rounded up into concentration camps. That is what China is doing. And I think for British academics to enjoy the freedom of the UK, to basically act as stooges for the CCP, it is repugnant. Repugnant. Shame on them. Um, if they're not going to find some sort of conscience, then the government needs to cut the funding at the very least. Um, as for the government, I would say the Johnson administration's done more It's sort of in the right direction. Certainly, it can't be accused of pandering to Beijing in the way that Cameron did, and I do think that was one of the worst legacies of Cameron's foreign policy. Um, and I give Dominic Raab credit. He has consistently condemned the human rights abuses by Beijing. He's been quite outspoken, so I do give Dominic Raab credit. But there's always more that can be done. And, Boris Johnson personally, I think, has wavered on this. I mean, he went from kind of giving the green light to Huawei to going back on it, and I'm not even sure what stage that is at the moment. Um, but there's always more we can do. I think we have to recognize that China sees British universities as a soft touch. So we need to really, you know, um, take this issue of infiltration seriously. And frankly, that does extend to Chinese students because they're being used by the Chinese government. It's true, they do pay a lot of money. I've worked with Chinese students. They tend to come from wealthy families, and the fees are pretty extensive. It goes into thousands. Um, I wouldn't promote a blanket ban, by the way. I wouldn't say, oh, let's just target all Chinese students. That would be wrong, because a lot of them are just normal young people who want to get their education and experience life in another country. I'm speaking as someone who's worked closely with them. But I have also spoken to people who have been harassed and bullied by mainland Chinese students. So there is a very real problem here. And I think we need to make it clear to the students that when you're in the UK, you're not in China. If you engage in bullying or threatening behaviour, you'll be suspended. Now, our universities so far have been pretty weak in that regard. Most they have done when these reports of bullying and harassment have been made is kind of give a generic, oh, everyone needs to respect each other. Not a single Chinese student has been suspended. I think they should be suspended and deported. If they're going to behave like that in this country, it would be unthinkable for a Westerner to behave that way in China and get away with it. So I do think we need to take a tough line. But then, of course, you'd have the left or some on the left who say, oh, it's racist. You can't do that. You can't stigmatize the Chinese students. They're being incredibly naive. They don't seem to appreciate what is going on here. I also think it's a pretty infuriating way to shut down debate by just smearing something as racist when that is not the issue. Indeed, Chinese dissident students could be targeted by the regime. So it's just as much in their interest to take action on this. Um, yeah, it's pretty infuriating to be honest, because it doesn't have to be this way. This isn't inevitable. This is something that academics are choosing to do. Whether it's just out of greed, like I say, whether it's to make themselves more comfortable, whatever it is, it's incredibly misguided. And this naive idea that if we just suck up to the Chinese, then they might change their ways, or we don't need to learn from China. Absolutely not. Because the much parroted line that it's an ancient civilization. Bear in mind the CCP is a relatively modern regime. We're talking 20th century. So this line about this whole notion of ancient wise culture, it does not apply to the CCP. Bear in mind the same CCP tried to destroy Chinese culture in the 60s and 70s. So they really are in no position to lecture. I just think that the more ground we give to Beijing, the more they will take it, and the more it will enable them to get to global hegemony. And then we really will pay the price. We will find that if China starts controlling the internet, I could be censored for making a video like this because Chinese software will control this, and they'll block out words that are criticizing the CCP. There's already indication that this is happening with Western companies. It's very concerning. So I think the useful idiots and Stooges, not exactly the same thing. They need to get all the criticism that goes their way because they're enabling Beijing. The CCP is going to do what it's going to do. That's what totalitarian regimes do. But that doesn't mean we should give them a hand with it. So, the likes of Professor Nolan and others who are um, enabling Beijing, I think is absolutely reprehensible. And I think they should be ashamed of themselves.